Hello, everybody. I was listening to Ron Paul talking about Trump's foreign policy recently, and foreign policy is determined by how much inflation the central banks can make in order to supply money to the government and to special interests. That's why central banking is so evil. Not to mention the fact that it destroys the economy in and of itself. You know, Milton Friedman was not a big government guy, but he was a big inflation guy. So even that is a problem. To try to determine the interest rate yourself is impossible to determine what it should be, because it should be fluctuating in an unfathomable way by the impulses of the entire market. And economics is not an experimental science. It's a science of common sense and of logic. And these terrible things we do in foreign policy are a result of inflationary policies. And but the main impulse of inflation, of expanding the money supply and creating artificial interest rates, either by themselves or by setting them, is to destroy the capital markets by perverting the capital markets away from whatever order of investment would have taken place, whatever hierarchy of investment would have taken place based on the savings rate. It destroys that relationship between how much people save and how much is invested, and therefore how the future will work out. Because if people save now and the interest rate reflects that savings, then when the borrowers invest, then what they produce is reflected in what was saved in the first place several years earlier. So that dynamic, but it's a very dynamical process of value being exchanged in an unfathomable way. It's not something that you can model, because society, life is based on individual impulses, subjective impulses. It's not based on an objective model of like a physical system. So when you presume to be able to model human societies, activities, and economies, you're going to end up with disaster every time. And the current inflation since the 1980s, since Paul Volcker gave up the Federal Reserve to Alan Greenspan, is to have an artificial interest rate far below what people would normally save at, which causes the people not to save. And yet, because the interest rate's so low, it causes the investor to invest. And that creates bubbles. So that created the 1990s bubble in the stock market, the dot-com bubble, which burst in 2000. Then it created the housing bubble right after that, because after that burst, George Bush didn't want to look bad, so he pumped money right into the housing market with Dodd-Frank. And that created a big housing market, and the banks were all leaning on these fake interests. The banks were being forced into making unsecure loans, and it created and it forced all that cheap money that Alan Greenspan made into lending into insecure or unsound loans, not the normal loans that people would normally come out of the market. with lending standards which would have developed. So they destroyed the market. They pumped it up. They infused it with cheap money and artificial lending standards because they were trying to recover since the stock market crashed. And so, when Clinton had that boom from all the capital gains that took place in the stock market, it wasn't because he did anything right on his own. It's not good to expand in that way. It's normal to have a normal growth of an economy. It doesn't have a potential for busting out. Moreover, the capital gets eaten up. It gets falsely invested or malinvested. And not to mention that when the government likes cheap money and the special interests like cheap money and the banks like cheap money, because then they can get a lot of wealth. They can steal a lot of wealth from us that way. And then they come up with war ideologies and welfare ideologies, all of which are inherently destructive. Besides the fact that you're destroying capital. So we've been doing that for 25 years, almost 30 years since Greenspan took over, and then Bernanke, and then Yellen. And they do the wrong thing every time there's a bust. We had a bust in 2000. We had a bust in 2008. And we're getting ready to have another bust. Because they come about every 8 or 10 years. As you go back in history, you'll see that. So, the question is Trump going to do what Warren Harding did in 1920, which was to ignore the advice of Herbert Hoover, who was his Secretary of Commerce, who 9 years later followed his own advice and created the Great Depression, along with the continuing help of Franklin Roosevelt, who did the same thing, only worse, even though he ran against Hoover in 1932, telling that Hoover was too spendthrift and too inflationary. But that's exactly what Roosevelt did, so that's why he protracted it another 16 years through the World War II. So what do we have now? We have a bunch of people who are ignoring economics because most economists don't even know economics. What I'm telling you is just logic. The whole point of interest rates is to coordinate the present with the future so that there's somebody to buy the stuff that the manufacturers make in the future. That's the whole point of it. A free market at interest rates will do that. So Trump should do that. He should do what Warren Harding did, which is to allow interest rates to rise so that there's capacity to save. Because nobody's saving anymore, right? Nobody keeps their money in the bank except a few old ladies, right? And it drives all that money into the stock market. That's the problem with cheap money, because you can't keep it in the bank. You lose your money, you lose your purchasing power. So you put it in the stock market. You're not even qualified. You're not interested. You're not predisposed to go into stocks. But they force people to do that. And so we have bubbles. We had the bubble in the housing market because they created an additional incentive to go into the housing market, cheap lending standards, forcing the banks. That created a big bubble. People were buying houses without even having a profit from the rent because they thought it was going to continue to go up, which it did till 2007 and 2008, right? And then the banks were broke. Now, what's going to happen in 2017? Well, it's an 8.6-year cycle, somebody told me. But whatever the cycle period is, it's going to break because the market is going to say, hey, there's something wrong, not just with the stocks, not just with the housing market, not just with the subprime mortgage markets, which are bundled mortgages, but there's something wrong with the dollar itself, because the dollar itself is overinflated. Now, you don't think there's too much inflation in terms of prices going up. Well, the reason we can still shop at Walmart is because the whole world's inflating in order to prop up the dollar. because they believe in a weak currency. A weak currency is the myth that a country needs to help its special interests who already have contracts with international contracts, who own the government. So China apparently has its industrialists who are selling to Walmart and other places in America apparently have a lot of political sway. Plus there's this Keynesian philosophy of a weak currency, of inflation being the source of growth. Inflation meaning the growth of the money supply. So use the word inflation that way. Don't use it in the terms of increasing the devaluation of the currency. So, because it's not the same thing, it doesn't even have an absolute correlation. So what Trump needs to do is to do what Warren Harding did and allow interest rates to rise, have the Fed set interest rates higher, and collapse the banks, and collapse the housing market, and collapse the stock market, and not let gold become wildly valuable in terms of the currency, or the prices of everything going through the roof in terms of the currency. Because when the market decides the currency is too dangerous, it's going to demand more interest, right? Because the interest is the payment for the currency. So that if you say, hey, I don't trust this currency, I need to have 10%, 15% instead of 2%, right? So it's going to drive up the demand for interest. And then so the Federal Reserve's got two choices. They either capitulate and raise interest rates, which means the government has to shut down its operations in foreign countries, all that warmongering, and it has to shrink the domestic spending and do means testing in Social Security and cut unconstitutional departments. All these extra departments are created in the last 50, 100 years. Get rid of them. You don't need them. Besides which, we can't afford them. We can't afford much anything anymore once this situation comes along, and it's about to. And the notion that it isn't is counter-historical. Every 8, 10 years we get a recession. But this time it'll be because the dollar is so thinned out, and the world's going to say, hey, I'm not going to peg my currency as a dollar anymore. And the demand for the dollar is going to go down. So then the Fed has two choices. They either capitulate and do the thing that's politically unpopular, which Trump should do, which is shrink the government and shrink taxes and let the people have the money back, because there is no value in somebody else, a third party, telling somebody else what to do in terms of creating value. The reason I say that is because only a person knows what he likes. Only a person knows what he likes, and what else is value except for what we like. It isn't objective. It isn't out there. It's in here, and then we get an objective measurement on the basis of what people create. Reality is created by the individual. It's not created by managers, especially involuntary managers, because when you go into an organization that might have hierarchy to it, you can always quit, except in the case of government. Government, it's compulsory to be contributory and participating at different levels. So we have to do what Warren Harding did. We have to let interest rates rise, which means you have to cut expenditures. And he's already cutting taxes and regulation, but you got to cut expenditures. This is not politically popular, but that's what he has to do to save the dollar from collapsing. Or they'll do the politically unpopular, the popular thing to do, and just print money up and bail everything out, buy up like they've been doing with these QEs. They've been buying mortgage-backed securities and treasuries in the last 4 or 5 years. The last 2 years, not so much. But previous to that, they're buying stuff up. And that's Keynesian economics, see, stimulation. The stimulation doesn't do it. What does it is autonomy, individual autonomy. That's what creates wealth. And that's what the money markets should be too. But that's a different subject, to transform ourselves into a gold-based currency, because that's a natural phenomenon that people worked out, that is money, that became money based on its characteristics, and the characteristics of having a problem of double coincidence of wants. And when barter, you have a problem of double coincidence of wants. You don't have that with money. Everybody wants money, gold and silver. So, is Trump got enough people around him? You know, some of these people, Austrian economists like Judge Napolitano or Rand Paul or Justin Amash, who know economics, and they know that you have to cut spending. Is he brave enough to do that and take a big hit? I mean, he's got the chutzpah and the political skill to do that if nobody else does. But is that going to happen? That's what has to happen. Otherwise, hello Venezuela, USA. Hello Zimbabwe, USA. It's the only option. That's the only logical option. We don't have to be esoteric here. You just know that hyperinflation can come. And by the way, prices are going up. You know that. The government's lying about how much prices are going up. But the reason they're not going up dramatically is because, as I said, foreign governments around the world prop the dollar up by pegging their currencies to it. That's just fundamental logic of economics. So, Mr. Trump, everything you do, many of the things you do I like. I don't like the militarism you seem to be perpetuating from the last 3 presidents. But let's say you decided to reverse everything. That's what would happen militarily, and social spending, domestic spending, would have to be reversed. This infrastructure stuff is no way. That doesn't drive the economy. No, sir. Particular infrastructures in local areas where they decide they need it, or especially if it's privately determined, that's even better. But you don't drive by spending. You drive by saving. That's what drives wealth. It's by saving. And then the interest rate goes down, and that tells the investor to invest. That's how it works. By freedom and by free money. So, Mr. Trump, if you don't do that, you're not going to go down as a great president. You're going to go down as a fool. Thank you.